Good morning, everybody. Good morning. We're about ready to start. Thanks for coming today. What a good turnout. We're talking about Ukraine. Next week, we're going to charge admission. Such a good turnout. That won't help our attendance anymore. We can do that. Thanks for coming to Contemporary Issues today. We're glad to talk about Ukraine and one of the most contemporary news issues there is, Putin and what's driving this war and why there's so much coverage of it, why it's unusual today, and just so many things to talk about. And Ron's going to allow questions and comments during his presentation, and especially afterwards. We'll have a nice discussion. Plenty of time for that too. But first of all, usual announcements. Zoomers, please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen. We're glad to have you here and hope you will talk too. But for the moment, mute yourself. Keep the noise down. We are recording for future playback too. And if you can't hear us, let us know. But we think the owl and our technology is working okay today. So we are going to share the screen here, click the button, and show some slides. And other announcements. How's everybody doing? Anything you'd like to share? Big serve coming up in the church. Joy.
Active Minds on Tuesday,
Active Minds class.
2 o'clock,
Okay.
and you get a cookie.
Mary.
Joe Gary's really struggling, so if any of you could reach out to him with cards. Who was that? Who?
Okay.
Marilyn's husband, Joe Gary.
Joe Gary. Lost his husband or his wife a couple months ago. Invited him to come back to class, but Joe is fairly shy.
He's
So-
having trouble coming to church, he said, because
Okay.
it reminds him of being with Marilyn.
With Marilyn. Oh, okay, good point. Okay, thank you for that. We'll do that. Okay. Any other announcements? Things? Okay, well, that everybody's doing good. Gene,
Is it appropriate or not?
to talk about your workshop
Just a
coming up?
quickie.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd say by popular demand, but 3 years ago, pre-COVID, we had a mini, Mary and I facilitated a mini workshop here at the church called Guided Autobiography. It was just a very condensed form, just to get people stimulated to do writing about legacy, memoirs, autobiographies, and so forth. We're going to do on May 14th from 9 until 4, one entitled Stories Up Close, looking at disabilities. And when I say disabilities, it will be intellectual, physical, emotional, or mental. The range of disabilities, if you think about it, is quite expansive. 1 in 5 families are dealing currently with a disability of one sort or another. As far as caregivers are concerned, it's 1 in 10 themselves have a disability they're dealing with. So this is intended particularly for people who have over time cared for someone with, in quotes, a disability, and to have an opportunity to write short and to get positive feedback and validation to stimulate the continued writing of stories. You are the librarians, so to speak. We are the librarians. 9 to 4, $25, lunch, refreshments, materials, handouts across the street here, 249. You register by going to search.gostandrews.com. First come, first serve. It's limited to 8. Reverend Lauren is facilitating, so it is a small group. Yes, yes. So first come, first serve, and invite all of you to give it attention if it perks your interest. Thank you.
What day is it?
You're welcome.
Saturday,
I'll send out
9 to 4.
I'll
Thank
send
you.
out an
Thank you.
email with the details since it's a class by one of our class members. Dr. Bob.
Jan and I are working with an Afghan family in addition to the one the church is working with. And it's a family of 6 great people, but we need housing for them. They're living with his sister. There are 11 people in a 2-bedroom apartment. So we need probably a 3-bedroom, and it must be in the city of Denver because of some other services that they're getting. So if you know of any way, and we have a group that can pay for it, but if necessary, but we can't find an apartment or a house that they can.
Need a rental?
Yes,
Yes, a rental.
preferably less than 2,000 a month,
Yeah.
which we know is asking for.
What about section?
I'll include that on the email I do about things and needs.
Great.
Or anybody knows of anything. let us
We'll work on it. Esther is chair. Okay, wonderful. Well, we want to jump into the Ukraine topic, and I'm sure that Ron will cover all the reasons for it, including the farmland that they want and minerals for Ukraine, as well as the people connection between Russia and Ukraine and Putin. And I was just telling Ron that I was reading a weak article that says that Putin is suspected to be not well also, and that he has 9 doctors that accompany him when he travels between around Moscow, and one of them is a
Mentally or
cancer.
physically?
Physically, one of them is a cancer specialist. So that is overarching all of this too. So we'll talk about that and everything. For anyone who doesn't know Ron, he is a retired engineer and book reviewer of ours and presenter of many good topics. And so this has been a special interest of Ron's for a while. In fact, I want to share just for a second the story that Ron and Alice told us recently, that they have friends who live in Ukraine, know of some folks who live in Ukraine, and have a house there, and that they looked out on their front yard a couple weeks ago, and there were 2 Russian soldiers sitting in their front yard, and they went out and talked to them, and they were 16-year-old boys roughly, and one of them was crying and saying, "I need to call my mother." And so they took him in the house and called his mother. The Ukrainian people reached out to that boy and connected him to his mother in Russia. What a nice story that was. So thank you, Alice, for telling us that story. Another connection to this whole sad. Okay, I'm rambling too much. Thank you, Ron.
Okay, certainly this is an issue that has everyone concerned. I know I've had some semi-sleepless nights thinking about it and the ramifications. I look down at Colorado Springs and elsewhere and wonder, when am I going to see a mushroom cloud? Could it possibly happen? Having worked in the nuclear industry and being well aware of the potential of nuclear weapons, it's a concern. I'm not paranoid about it, but I'm a realist enough to know that it's a dangerous world out there that does put us at stress. Okay, we've drawn on a tremendous number of resources for this lesson. 2 of the very best ones, maybe more than that, are some of the PBS Frontline presentations. There's several DVDs. I'm going to pass this one around. Putin's Revenge. There's several other ones. About a month ago, Marie Yovanovitch, who was an ambassador not only to the Ukraine, but to several of the Soviet satellite spin-offs, published her book. And she gives reviews of several of the Soviet satellite spin-off states and gives some good insight to what's really going on there. So I'll pass that around as well. Of course, as Steve mentioned, one of our favorite magazines, The Week, gives good summaries and both sides of issues. It's another good resource. And let's get going. How many here ever watched Rocky and Bullwinkle? Okay, I used to laugh at Boris Batnoff when I was a little boy. And we've got a few of his cartoons, Boris and Natasha, sprinkled in. He's saying there, no ceasefire until Moose and Squirrel are dead. Remember Mr. Big and some of the characters there?
And they were Russian, like Boris and Natasha.
Yeah, and they laid on that accent, didn't they?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first slide, I've got a picture of Alex Vindman, And Vindman, of course, had a book, and we reviewed it here in this class. And there was an excellent interview he gave, and that interview is online. There's the address. But he goes through in detail how he assesses the situation, how he thinks it might carry through to a conclusion, and his opinions on it. Excellent resource.
Well, is he the one that got fired as an NSA?
Yes, he testified in the impeachment trial and was basically pushed out. I shouldn't laugh at such a serious situation, but I'm joking that Putin sent in a survey to a dating service, and they sent him back his picture with a match. Okay. Yeah. Over 2,000 years ago, there's a book that's lived through history written by Sun Yan called The Art of War. And there's a quote that's been on the Facebook quite a bit. An evil enemy will burn his own nation to the ground to rule over the ashes. We're seeing some of that now in Ukraine, where Putin is not only going in there thinking he would take it over in 2 or 3 days, and instead is ending up destroying it. Again, here are some of the resources that I recommend. I recommend Maria Ivanovich's book, Alex Vindman book, which we reviewed here in this class, Here Right Matters, and Fiona Hill's book, which we also reviewed in class. There's nothing here for you. All right. I mentioned if you have one thing to watch, I would recommend you go on the internet, go to YouTube, and watch the interview with Julia Ioffe. I may be butchering the pronunciation, Renee, but it's called Putin's Road to War. And it was, right now, of all the things I've read and watched, that is the best and most succinct and most incisive analysis of the situation that I have seen. So get online and review that. Next slide. There's a picture of Julie Ioffe, and in that she quotes some of the meetings that were going on inside the Kremlin that Putin was directing. And she makes this one quote in the slide. They were up there, and when they went up there and dutifully said what the master wanted them to say. She was expressing in this thing how when this inner circle was meeting under Putin's direction, how they were all kind of under his control. He almost had them under kind of a mind control. They're scared to death of him. They're afraid to stand up to him. He's the opposite of that book written by the lady in Brooklyn on the advisors to President Lincoln, A Team of Rivals. It's just the opposite of A Team of Rivals. He puts around him and intimidates those that are in his presence. Next one. Reaching back in history, and certainly we could do a full history course in Russia. Fill many a week on this. We're just going to brush over a few things that are appropriate. Near the end of World War II, there was the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference. The Yalta Conference just months before the war ended, with Roosevelt, who was just alive barely, Churchill and Stalin, and they carved up Eastern Europe. And then a few months later, with Roosevelt gone, Truman took his place at the follow-on conference, the Potsdam Conference. And there's one quote on here. Churchill particularly was suspicious of Stalin's motives and the unyielding position that Stalin took at that conference. We're also going to mention a little later in this book, and probably in a future lesson, a book by Anne Applebaum, Red Famine, Stalin's War on the Ukraine. I'm reading this book right now, and it's incredible. It's like a repeat of history. But Poland particularly has had a terrible history. We've got a handout today. They've been brutalized by both the Nazis and the Russian invaders, and had millions of their citizens killed. I believe in World War II, but between the onslaughts from both sides, Poland lost something like 20% of its civilian population, which is just incredible. And the handout explains how the Russians collected mainly the intelligentsia, all the officers of the Polish army they could find, took them out to an area called Katyn, maybe mispronouncing that, but slaughtered them by the thousands and ended up killing massive numbers of Poles. So Russia has a history of brutality. Okay, the Iron Curtain, right after World War II, the Soviet Empire, the Soviets extended their Iron Curtain into vast parts of Eastern Europe, including Poland, Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and the Soviet Union. On Spear Boulevard, not too far from downtown, there's a memorial statue to the people who died in the, I believe, 1956 Soviet invasion of Budapest and Hungary. And that's right here in the city of Denver. So the Soviet domination extended to vast areas of Eastern Europe, and probably as a kid growing up, you remember hearing stories of people behind the Iron Curtain, particularly people in East Germany getting killed as they tried to escape, get over the wall. But things started happening. The Solidarity movement in Poland arose. I believe the Pope, one of the earlier popes, came out of Poland, Wash Walensky, I butcher his name.
John
But,
23.
Yeah, he came out of the Polish crisis of 1980-81. And that was one of the first really strong pushbacks that started to break down the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. All right, go ahead. Solidarity, yeah. So in the 1990s, there was tremendous turmoil in Russia and Eastern Europe. Literally, Russia was breaking apart. Millions lost their jobs as the Russian state transformed into a somewhat free economy. And Boris Yeltsin labeled the program shock therapy. State-owned enterprises were sort of auctioned off, partitioned off, given away, and there was terrible suffering and transitioning in the Soviet Union. As always, they prioritized their defense spending during this health crisis. Didn't help their people, poured billions into armaments, nuclear weapons. The third bullet there says some of the most remote Russian cities lost more than 20% of their population. Some of the smaller towns, 50%. And more than 1 million Russians ended up moving largely into the Moscow area. So again, in the 80s, there was a famous quote by our President Reagan, June 12th of 1987, "Tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev." And the Soviet grip on the Eastern Bloc broke. Revolutions in Poland and Hungary paved the way for massive demonstrations in East Germany. And Putin had an assignment as a KGB agent in East Germany and saw what was happening. Saw how the East Germans rose, tore down the wall, celebrated. This picture you can't see very well of East Germans climbing on the Berlin Wall. And by 1991, this is an event that isn't as well known, but certainly a celebratory day. The Soviet Union in 1991 saw devastating levels of unemployment and poverty, state collapsed, and it split into 13 to 15 different sub-entities. And a lot of them have Stalin names to them over on the right-hand side. And then we're going to pull up the next slide. It shows how the Soviet Union split up. Probably too small to read effectively, but in the spring of 1990, the first three to break away from that massive Soviet group were Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia in the spring of 1990. And then within a year, all the other ones following in a period of about 7 months in 1991.
If you hit that button slideshow at the top, it'll make it larger so you can see it better.
Actually, this one right here. That one right
Do it also.
Right, right.
That's reading.
Oh.
Okay,
there. Yeah. it's
okay.
And then hit the little square in the upper right. See
better.
that little square in the upper right?
Keep going.
Okay, but we can see how the USSR broke into 15 pieces. And it all happened in a matter of months. So this massive Soviet empire suddenly breaks into many substates, one of which is Ukraine. And of course, the 3 Lithuanian countries and some other countries that are in danger of being the next ones on the list, like Armenia and Moldavia. All right, next one.
You can drag that other thing out of the
Let's
way.
take us to
Drag the bar up and that'll get rid of it.
There we go, forward. Okay. So in December 1991, of course, Gorbachev resigned as president and handed it over to Yeltsin. And Yeltsin tried his best, but there was still economic turmoil. The Soviet Empire kept crumbling. And by, next slide, please. About a decade later, Yeltsin decided he was going to quit.
There we go.
All right. Some of the, when we did the lesson on authoritarianism, we talked about the personality trait of being a social dominator. Social dominator comes up on a test called the Social Dominance Orientation Scale. And they basically have the attributes of wanting dominance, power, low empathy, and forget right wrong. You just use morality and rules as things to play games with. You don't really try to follow them. So that's one of the characteristics of the social dominator. Certainly we're going to see who matches that. And then of course the social dominator, next slide, needs followers, what we call the authoritarian followers. And these are people who are more submissive, fearful, and longing for a mighty leader who protect them from life's threats. And we see authoritarian people coming up, not only in politics, as far as national leaders, but we also particularly see them coming up in religious groups. You tend to divide the world as an authoritarian follower into friend and foe. You like your friends and thems, or the people you quote don't like. You become ethnocentric, partial to your own group, based on your religious and political thinking. There's a snapshot that was taken in a Trump rally, which kind of makes you, oh boy. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for President Trump. You can just see the look in that lady's eyes holding the baby, just, you know, oh, just enamored. And it's a real danger when people become such strong authoritarian followers. Okay. Well, Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, got rid, decided he was going to resign. He was having health problems. He was generally conceded as being an alcoholic.
Yep.
His country was faltering. He had some embarrassing things that publicized about him. So who does he pick to be his follower? Unfortunately, Vladimir Putin. Putin, of course, his background is KGB. Oh God, help us. More ways than one.
Putin was not elected that time. It was,
No, he wasn't.
appointed.
He was appointed, but there was an election just months later. But he was and is a very good politician. He managed to very quickly build, put out a charismatic image, and he won the election very handily. But then we get this guy. The oligarchs thought that maybe Putin would be somebody that they could kind of mold and put into the characteristics that they wanted. But were they ever, and the world was ever in for a surprise. There's a book out there, a couple of books out there by Masha Gessen. The one's called The Man Without a Face, and it's described on Amazon how an obscure, small-minded KGB operative ascended to the Russian presidency and in a short period of time destroyed years of progress and made Russia a threat to its own people and the world. Again, he was picked as successor by the family surrounding Boris Yeltsin. And suddenly he became a guy that learned how to play the system and quickly learned how to get a grip on power with his authoritarian tendencies. He dreamed of ruling the world, rose as a public figure, his popularity soared. He seized control of the media, it was one of his key ways of getting to the top, sent political rivals and critics into exile or the grave. We all remember the number of people he's pushed out of windows, poisoned, that have kind of suddenly had something happen to them. And he smashed the country's fragile electoral system, concentrating the power into his hands. He took one of the lady cosmonauts, who was very popular, and had her as a member of the Russian Congress put forth a bill to make him president for essentially as long as he wants. And right now he's got a grip on power till 2036, and maybe beyond. A little background on him. He was born in St. Petersburg, otherwise known as Leningrad. In the shadow of it, age 71 day siege that killed millions. His dad was a factory worker who also helped the Communist Party law enforcement arm. So his dad was not a very, well-educated or intelligent guy. He was a plain old factory worker who helped be like a ruffian policeman, secret policeman, as an evening job. Putin grew up in a drab communal apartment where he and his friends chased rats in the hallways. And he said he was a short, scrawny boy who was bullied, took up judo and the Soviet martial art Sambo, which teaches remaining stoic in the face of great pain. He earned a reputation as a ruthless street fighter, unafraid to take on bigger opponents and other bullies. So he became kind of a, shall we say, a king of the bullies. He was inspired by books and movies of resourceful KGB agents. Reportedly, even in high school, asked about signing up to be the KGB. Alice and I watched that movie a few weeks ago. If you want to go back and put the timetable back on where it's turned into now, pull out the Bond movie, The Living Daylights. In fact, there's a guy in there who looks a bit like Putin, who makes a raid on a British kitchen to steal back one of their KGB people. But that movie is filled with KGB and comments on the Russian economy. So if you want to get a little entertainment, if there is such a thing with the situation, go watch that movie. Putin's convictions. Look at that first one. Everything can be manipulated. He's a master at playing the chess game. Public relations, manipulating, controlling. Of course, when you're not afraid to kill people, your opponents, that's the ultimate. He was indoctrinated by the KGB counterintelligence career, secret agent desire, and his idea was to reduce democracy and centralize authority under him. He was quoted by Boris Yeltsin and a couple of American presidents saying he doesn't have democracy in his heart. Yeltsin later regretted passing the reins over to him, saying he was fooling us. He thought he was going to continue this democratic transition of the Soviet Empire. He had other thoughts in mind. He wanted to go back to the good old days, make Russia great again in his own mold. He wanted to take us back to the 50s. Said he wanted a bipolar society again, where you had the United States, you had Russia, and they were at heads. Everybody feared those two entities.
There was a story in the New York Times quoting parts of a story that Putin wrote saying, democracy's time is over. People around the world don't want democracy anymore. They want authoritarian governments because they're more efficient, and that plays into people's desire for strong leaders. It's a clearer, more efficient mode of government, and that's what and others think today. Democracy's gone. This is the time of authoritarian, efficient governments. China, yeah. Just thought I'd throw that in too.
Again, he took control of the TV, squashed the independent TV stations. He's walked into the past, and he's nursing resentments. He's been described personally. Madeleine Albright said he was reptilian. Hence that earlier slide I showed. It was he's dating match.
I think he's sterilized.
Sterile, yeah.
Sterilized.
Sterile.
Sterilized.
Animal.
Like a possum.
So the New York Times had an article in March of just a few weeks ago. Said, did the United States and its allies, through excess optimism or naivete, get Mr. Putin wrong from the outset? Or was he transformed into the warmonger of today, whether because he perceived Western provocation, gathering grievance, or intoxication since COVID-19, or was there something else that transformed him? He's obviously gotten worse. Picture emerges of a man who sees on almost every move by the West as a slight against Russia. So he saw on the chessboard that everything we did as being a slight to him. He became a Russian oligarch, kind of, I'm going to make Russia great again. And you get a messianic vision of inspired imperial glory for Russia. Okay, next one. In fact, here's a quote, Putin's own words about Ukraine. Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. Since time began, people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russian. So again, he sees the Ukrainian people as an integral part of Russia. It won't let him go. And yet, if you watch the frontline presentation by the lady I mentioned on the earlier slide, she'll say, hell no, Ukrainians do not see themselves as part of Russia. In fact, their intensity and hatred, commitment against Russia now is at an incredibly high level. It's near unanimity. So his vision is just off. Maria Ivanovich in her book says, in a review, she said, we partly caused this. And she said, Trump had a role in doing this. Ivanovich said that the perfect Trump Zelensky phone call explains a lot. Zelensky was begging Trump for the Javelin anti-tank rockets, but Trump was blocking it, stalling, and trying to get a favor. And Marie said essentially, Trump might have concluded that Putin probably figured from that phone call, the U.S. didn't give about Ukraine, wouldn't have defended if push came to shove. And she says, in her opinion, Trump probably wouldn't have. But of course, there was a new president came in, and things have changed. Also, in James Comey's book, A Higher Loyalty, he talked about the meeting that with all the Russians came into the Trump Tower to meet with the Trump re-election committee. And he heard some things there that made his hair stand on end.
That phone call was where Trump called Ukraine and said, we'll give you weapons if you give me the dirt on Biden, my political opponent. So that was the setting for that.
Margaret Hoover interviewed her last week on her Friday night program, and I believe if you're a PBS member, you can go back on Passport and watch it, as you can the Frontline programs.
Okay,
But you have to be a PBS donor and have the passport app or whatever.
I was able to go in and watch several of the front lines yesterday without any special permissions or
Yeah,
memberships.
Obama failed to react to the overtake of Crimea too.
That is correct.
All these sanctions on Russia,
Right.
way back.
Yeah.
then.
We didn't do much at all.
Well, it's redlining may have encouraged Putin also. Is redlining in Syria that nothing happened? That
Yeah.
Obama said this is a red line in Syria, and they crossed it and nothing happened. So that may have emboldened
Exactly.
Putin to go farther now into Ukraine.
Once again, I'm showing a cartoon I love. Boris Batnoff there saying, "Tell them it's fake news, work of moose and squirrel." And then Fiona Hill, in her interview of just a month ago, said Trump would come to more to resemble Putin in political practice and predilection than he resembled any of his recent American presidential predecessors. So, next one. Vindman's opinion. Of course, Vindman is no fan of Trump. Vindman's conclusions from his interview. The Trump administration lurched the looming confrontation with Putin forward significantly. Trump undermined NATO alliance and weakened the U.S. democracy internally. January 6th insurrection sent a message to the world that we were weaker and divided. And then Tucker Carlson's been on Russian TV, giving some of its early complimentary comments, cheerleaders for Putin. So Vindman said, too much hope was put into the promise, good relationship with Russia, instead of better relationship with the countries that could actually bear fruit. Here's some of Trump's words on Trump undermines NATO. And of course, one of the worst things that ever happened was the Trump Helsinki speech. We got up in front of the world in Helsinki with Putin by his side and said, Putin assured me that he didn't monkey with our election, despite, and I agree with Putin, not our own internal intelligence agencies. And several of the front line commentators have said this was handed Putin everything he dreamed of. This was a dream come true.
He had a grin on his face.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I've talked a lot. Let's talk about what can we do on the national level and then on the personal level. Vindman said, in his opinion, the thing we need to do on the national level is do all the lend-lease we can. In other words, give Ukraine all the help we can in terms of both armaments, foodstuffs, aid of any kind, medicines, support and accept sacrifices to back up the sanctions. That means higher gas prices. Quit bitching about higher gas prices and accept it as a sacrifice we need to make to do something about this guy. Support politicians who are pro-democracy at both the international and the national level. There's plenty of them out there in both parties, if you look carefully. And then, of course, I had mentioned Ben Franklin's quote just a couple weeks ago. Those who beat their swords into plowshares usually end up plowing for those who kept their swords. Ben Franklin. And I am not a go-go war defense, all this, although I believe in a very strong American military. But I'm also not a believer in singing Kumbaya is not going to do it in this world. And we've certainly seen that in the last personal level. You better think beyond your stock portfolio value, your Disney vacation plans, and more expensive gasoline. Recognize Potter wasn't the hero. It's a Wonderful Life. George Bailey was. And on TV, I love Kevin Costner, and it's a great series. But sometimes on TV, we try to say, we try to get an American image where I'm going to own my own ranch empire in Montana or Texas, and I'm just going to have almost complete freedom to rule my own little empire, do what I want. I don't want any government interference. Who needs other people? And so sometimes the TV and sometimes many Americans try to create an image like we live in a world where we can all be our own little independent empires. It ain't so. I agree with Fred Rogers. We live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say it's not my child, not my community, not my world, not my problem. Then there are those who see the need and respond. I consider those people my heroes. So you see the world as a we or a me. You see it as a me, you say, forget the Russian situation. As long as they're not coming after me, I'm okay. The other viewpoint is to say, you better think of everybody in the world, not just our own little hides.
Which is what America did in World War II until we got bombed at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
America first. That's where it started, with Lindbergh and Kennedy.
So my advice, whip your mind and spirit not to fold under the pressure of this sport. This is a situation, unlike a TV show, so many TV shows, the problem arises 30 minutes into the 1 hour show, they've pretty much got it well on the way to solution. They solve it, and then with the last 10 minutes, it's all kiss, hug, and the disease has been cured, the bad guys have been caught, all is going back to normal. Well, this Ukrainian war could go on for a long time. At the very least, he's blown the hell out of that country. And it's not going to disappear in a few days.
I've heard commentary, and I don't know much about this stuff, but I've heard commentary saying that if the United States would agree to subsidize and help our NATO members that are dependent upon Russian oil, and we would file a complete sanction of Russian oil, that the whole thing would end in 30 days. Like I say, that's just what somebody else said. So but I'd like to know if anybody has a feel for it, because it seems to me to be a solution.
I'm not sure we have the economic power to undergird the world's oil prices for a sustained period of
Well,
several
we're
years.
oil
several
exporting
years.
To supply the,
country.
yeah, or Canada has a lot of oil and natural gas liquids.
Liquefied natural gas.
How to get it over
I
there.
mean, it would take a while.
Okay.
But it makes people very nervous when they say that the gas is going to go up to $6 a gallon.
Following
It's a
up on
small price to pay.
following up on the economic, Jim, BBC last night, the reason Le Pen is so strong in France right now in today's election is that 54% of the citizens of France are more concerned about the economy than the Ukraine war. That's not a big issue. It's the economy. So again, B and D, as you were saying, as far as paying a little more for gas and so forth, but the economics that are driving attitudes.
John's got 2 more slides and then we'll do full discussion.
Yeah, and actually, this is just an advertisement for a lesson I'm working on. And then one cartoon. This is kind of Putin, a bully. I feel sorry for you, Mo. You must have some serious personal problems. This is how you relate to people. Okay, so how do you handle this stress that's been put on all of us? And maybe you're not feeling it. you're saying, I'll just go take a hike and walk in the park and not worry about it. How are you handling? What are some of the tools in your inventory that you're using to handle this situation? Comments from the class, really eager to hear them.
Eric was telling me before class that he only watches about 10 minutes of it on TV, so you don't get too overwhelmed with the images and the frustration that can come.
That's what I wish I did,
You wish you did.
but I end up watching a lot more. and then I
And
end
on
up
the other
depressed.
hand, you have to know what's going on.
Yeah, you do. It has to be a balance. But
But you wonder if it doesn't.
anybody been giving money or anything to specific places?
My
Where-
Rotary Club has
where-
given a lot of
Who else have you given to? Red Cross or
World Central Kitchen.
World Central Kitchen? Okay.
The Young Corps, the United Methodist.
Yes, okay.
UNICEF,
Jan?
CARE,
Project Cure, that's part of Big Sur and is here locally. They have been sending lots and lots and lots of equipment, medication, all of that to Ukraine. So that's one of the ways that we can here support, and that's one of the things that we've been giving monetarily to, and that's one of our Big Sur projects, and people can volunteer there all the time. So that's a way to support Ukraine.
Doctors Without Borders is another.
Yes.
Doctors Without Borders.
I guess Blinken's gonna go, and Secretary of Defense are going to Ukraine.
That's the thing, something we can all do personally or long term, and reduce how much fossil fuel we use. Because our fossil fuel use is funding a lot of places we don't like. that don't like us.
I'm a big nuclear power proponent, so small nuclear reactors.
Amen.
Anybody online, we want to give you a chance to talk too, if you'd like to. What have you been doing? Susan, go ahead.
So you opened the session today by saying that, this is the topic worldwide, and that's probably true, but what we've found through the coverage worldwide is that there are so many countries that are either abstaining on votes at the UN or not supporting, NATO. We have India, China, we can't get Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi to produce more oil. I mean, you can say, yeah, Canada can do it, but really, I don't think the US or Canada has the capacity to make up the difference. So it's very frustrating because the world does not see this in the same way that we do. And I just don't know how it's going to end.
Yeah, there's talk of even possibly America putting sanctions on countries that are staying neutral and continuing to do business with Russia, but that hasn't gone very far. So, yeah, it's a complicated situation because of those who remain neutral doing business with Russia.
You know, we have a niece who lives in Switzerland, in Zurich. And when I called her, emailed her to find out what her position was on all this, it's just daylight just goes on. It's like they hardly even have an effect from this at all. It's very, I was just amazed that, she's in school, nursing school, and it's like, okay, I'm just studying. All this stuff is going on and it really doesn't affect their lives, so they don't pay attention to it. And I think in a way, a lot of people, until they are directly affected by something, they're not going to take a stand and do something.
Well, Switzerland's not known for choosing one
Well,
side or the other.
this is very true, but her son is a policeman there, and you would think, I don't know, they've got to be aware of what's going on.
I thought Switzerland gave up its neutrality.
They did. They did.
Susan says they did.
But I wonder how many of the US college students, you asked them the same thing, what they would answer. Well, Well, this lady's actually in
My
her 50s.
grandchildren. They're into it. In fact, is I hope they don't go signing up for the army. I didn't know.
Interesting stories about thousands of people from around the world that have just gone on their own dime to
Yeah.
Ukraine to fight.
Yeah.
Kids from California and just getting on a plane and going there. And some of them in Ukraine are saying, we don't want you because if Russia captures you, they'll use you as a political pawn against the US or wherever you came from. So complicated.
It is.
Wars are not simple. Do you think we're doing the right thing with just providing weapons and not troops, America? Are we doing it the right way?
I think so.
I think so.
Anybody disagree?
I really, I struggle with that.
Well, the risk of nuclear war.
Yes, yes.
We are going to have upcoming in a few weeks, Mike Ivy, our class member, is going to present on non-resistance.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave here in about 2 minutes.
And even
11:30 was my time.
Joe, you've got your volume on. And the idea of not to resist in war because of where it says in the Bible, turn the other cheek. And also we could talk, Mike, about how that relates to like the civil rights movement, non-violent resistance. So just another side, but we're going to take a whole hour to talk about that kind of thing too.
You know, when you could talk about, the books I've read on Eisenhower, you talk about man, mutually assured destruction. Doesn't work unless both sides are fearful of the other side launching their nuclear weapons.
Yes. Yes.
And so he would never tell anyone, including his wife, whether or not he would use nuclear weapons. He told nobody. It was his secret only, because he didn't want anybody speculating on the fact that he didn't want to use nuclear weapons. He had to make them think he would use
Yeah,
them.
that's the whole premise of mutually assured destruction. Lois.
I just wondered if other people had read about the fact that a lot of the people out of Ukraine were being shipped to Russia.
Yes.
And are they being sent to these gulags in Siberia like in the 80s and 90s? Well, 80s up until 91, when, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, those people were sent over there. And we had a speaker in Lithuania who had been on one of those trains and lived in the gulags for several years. And she was one of the few in her family who were able to get back. And then we also heard from our tour guide, whose grandparents, of course, were in that same situation. And they were not allowed to say anything when they, after the freedom. It was like, well, why didn't we know more about this? Was our head in the sand or what? But the fact that they were fearful that they would be sent back if they opened their mouth. This was 91.
Gene.
Ron, it's also been reported that he's been giving millions of dollars to the Russian Orthodox Church to bless the efforts. Part of what you gave is the historical backdrop of Mother Russia and its history, but also what has caught the attention of the church is it's a war against the decadence of the Western countries of the world, moral decadence, gay rights, the minority rights, etc., and so forth, and so on. So he's using the moral thing, but he's also heavily subsidizing the church to get the blessing.
Yeah, the Russian Orthodox Church has not spoken out against the war. And probably because Putin is so strong and because 80% of the Russian people believe Putin and back the war against the decadent West.
Well, he said,
what would you do if you were the head of the Russian
well, the
Orthodox
bishop did
Church?
say yesterday, he hopes it comes to an end soon.
Okay.
That's all he said.
Oh, well,
That's it.
You mentioned my presentation, that's one of the things that I was going to cover in my presentation is just war theory and how that can be manipulated by the church to sanction state sanctioned wars and murders if they believe they're morally right. That may be very well beliefs of the Orthodox Church is that they truly do believe this is a moral action, which is the slippery slope you get.
Great topic, Jan.
Bob and I've been reading lately about war criminals, and there's a lot of confusion about what that actually is. And Bob said he was listening to a NPR yesterday about Carter bringing up that during his presidential reign, that war criminals, there were a lot of war criminals from World War II living in the United States, et cetera. I would really love to have programs or a Sunday school class sometime about war criminals and what that really is, and how do we follow up on that, because I know Biden is constantly talking about Putin is a war criminal, and it's like, well, okay, what does that really mean, and what do we do about it? And so anyway, that would be of interest to me.
Go for it. You present it.
I don't know enough about it.
Well, read up on it.
Well, and any discussion of that kind has to include the bombing of civilians during World War II.
Well, sure, yeah, and the bombing of civilians is happening now. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what does that really mean? Yeah.
So many good topics.
Well, I think that's what it is.
We've got a couple minutes left.
I think they also, I think Russia blocked out a lot of media like Instagram, Facebook, so that the whole picture is, none of the citizens know really what's going on. I think blocked out Facebook, Instagram.
But not Telegram. Apparently Telegram is still, yeah, it's called it's a social media site called Telegram. That's still getting through. As well as people who sign up for the VPN on their internet. Apparently they can get news as well.
Pat and I were in Russia, I think in 2005, or somewhere around. And I was totally oblivious of the fact that in talking to Russian people, especially in St. Petersburg, but in Moscow also, the anger that was residual against the West, specifically the United States, with individuals, that when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the desperation that existed in that country was so overwhelming, and we did nothing. And that anger, at least back in 2005, was palpable. I mean, you could hardly have a decent conversation. Why did you, as Christians, just as human beings, not help us? We were literally starving. And I think that is a huge error that we need to talk about, because I think we're at risk of letting politics get in the way of our humanity.
Well, we did get involved, but through investment bankers and went over to help the oligarchs. We did get involved through investment bankers that went over to help the oligarchs set up their regimes and exploit the situation, trade currency and all those things, take advantage of the collapse of the state. So we were involved, but we were involved from a typical profit incentive.
Esther, remember that conversation that we had about you and Dorsey hadn't taken a tour of Russia on the bus and you had to go outside? Would you tell them what you saw?
Well,
this was when?
Well, we were there in 2013.
Okay.
And our guide, we had a gentleman that kept asking all kinds of questions. And she said to us, the man said, well, should we be careful speaking? She said, be careful what you say, who you say it to, and who else is around, because she said, they're still out there, they're still collecting information. And so, so we were careful. I remember when we walked into Red Square, they had a person impersonating Stalin, Gorbachev, and Putin. And so we were talking to the guide, and she said, people in the West need to pay attention. She said, Putin wants to be Stalin. And she said, remember, Stalin killed many million more people than Hitler ever did. Nothing was ever done about it.
And then outside of the city, when the tour bus took another route.
Oh, we took another route. We couldn't get through the main pathways. And so the bus driver says, well, I'm going to go off route. And of course, the pathways, they take you, the buildings all look fine. When you got off the path about maybe 5 or 6 blocks, buildings were boarded up. They had not been repaired since the war. There was all kinds of graffiti. There were people, there were people laying in the streets that were hungry, or maybe, I don't know.
So you got to see the best part.
So we got to see the real
Potemkin
Russia.
villages.
And see, another thing too, when we visited Estonia in 2017, and the problem with Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania is that Estonia has, at that time, 25% of their population is Russian, and they consider themselves Russian. They've never blended into the Estonian society. So she said, we're very careful who we let come into our country, because we don't want to get a larger percentage of Russia that wants to go back to Russia. And so I noticed that they've talked 2 or 3 times about when people were trying to leave Russia to go into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, they did not have a European passport. They were not letting them in if they just had a Russian passport. And I only heard that 2 or 3 times, but I thought back to what this lady said. They don't want to get a higher percentage of Russian back in those small countries, because those people want to go back, and they told them, well, why don't you go back to Russia? And they said, oh, we never want to go back there. She said, it's terrible back there. So there's all kinds of issues going on with people that live in those border states, with Russian population there. But no, it really, we went to a small town, a little tiny town up southeast of St. Petersburg. I went to see a school, I went to see an elementary school. And so we're riding on this bus, and my husband says, well, there aren't any electric wires here. So we asked the lady, and then we talked to the guide, and she says, oh no, she said, we still use kerosene up here. And they did not have indoor plumbing. They all had outhomes. One of the tours that we took from the bus was they went to this brand new home of this couple that were teachers. And they were so proud of their home, and they said it was gorgeous, but no running water. They said, we want to show you our new well. They said, it's brick lined. It's the latest edition of wells. They still were going out. They had no running water in their home. It's just
electricity.
Well, these little tiny towns, 2 tiny towns we went through, there was no electricity. They were still using kerosene.
Well, that gives us a good picture. Of
I don't know how widespread that is, but it's there.
Yes. We need to wrap up and let our people go here. Thank you, Ron, for another great presentation. Watch the Frontline episode. Looks really good.
Yeah.
Okay, come back and visit us next week. We are going to have a lady who is a Methodist missionary to this area of Eastern Ukraine, who's a member here, Courtney Randall. Reverend Courtney Randall is going to tell us about what it's like to be a missionary in Eastern Europe. So come back next week. Thanks, Zoomers, for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Well, that's right.